Gormagat the Ceann Comhairle. Can I say that I welcome this bill, and I think the Statute Law Revision project is a hugely valuable project going on as it is now for I think over 20 years. When I worked for Enda Kenny TD, as he was then leader of Fine Gael in opposition, as his legal advisor, and the first of these bills, which was the Statute Law Revision pre-1922 Bill 2004, I think, became the Act 2005, I had more time to peruse some of the 18th century and older pieces of legislation that were being deleted or expunged by that legislation. But it's a hugely important project, and to say that it is an arduous task that those involved in it face is an understatement. I understand for this bill there were 40,000 secondary instruments reviewed to ascertain if they were obsolete and to be replaced, and of those 3,367 will be repealed of the bill. So it's an enormous volume of material to go through, but it's obviously a very valuable and important process. And a perusal of the bill will tell you some of the very interesting proclamations that are being dealt with in it. One was for a proclamation for apprehending the persons who posted an illegal notice at Tubber near Dunlavin, County Wicklow, warning Thomas Holland to give up certain lands on the 4th of April 1834. I don't know whether Thomas did that or not, but it's certainly interesting that we should do away with that piece of that legislative instrument at this stage. There was another one, a proclamation for apprehending the 16 men who walked into the Royal Canal Company's storeyard of the Royal Canal Harbour parish at St Michael's, County Dublin, and broke several barrels belonging to Mr Guinness, brewer, in 1837. A proclamation for apprehending the persons who set fire to a large stack of flax belonging to James Caldwell of Tavanvetton parish in Kilmore, County Armagh in 1837, an order setting the close time for salmon in the Skibbereen district in 1856, a proclamation appointing January the 6th, 1826 as the day from which the silver and gold coins of Great Britain may pass current and circulate in Ireland, was in 1825, or another order requiring all the pensioners, the out-pensioners and Chelsea Kilmainham Hospital men to show up for fitness exams in December 1821. So there's such a wide variety of material covered by this. It is actually extraordinary. And as I say, this is a culmination of a project that has gone through iterations in the 2007 Act, the 2009 Act, 2012, 2015, 2016. So it is an enormous volume of work that is to be done. One other one that drew my attention is reference number 139 in the appendix, which relates to my own area, an order convening a meeting for carrying the Lighting of Towns Ireland Act 1828 into force in the town of Kingstown. But one that caught my eye particularly relates to Monkstown, and it's number 1210 in the appendix from the 9th of August 1836. And it's a proclamation for apprehending the persons who broke into the watch house and vault in the churchyard of the Union of Monkstown in the district of Dublin Metropolis and forced the lid off a coffin and left the body exposed in an offensive manner. And for that to happen in 1836, to cast back to what Monkstown was like at that time, was absolutely extraordinary, because most of what we now know as Monkstown in Dublin wasn't even built at that time. The railway wasn't built until 1837, and the railway absolutely transformed that area of Dublin as the first commuter railway in the world, the Dublin to Kingstown Railway, as it was known, from what is now Pearse Station, I think, out to Dunleary. It changed the whole topology of that area, or topography of that area, because it was built across the sands at Sandymount and Blackrock. It created a lagoon inside the track and created an entirely different coastline. So now when you're in Blackrock, you can see sea cliffs within the park that prior to 1837 were actually where the waves would have crashed up from Dublin Bay. But again, at that time, Monkstown was very much a rural area, and an area occupied by people in isolated houses, many of them large houses that were owned by merchants who worked in Dublin and had them as their country residences. But also those are lands that were given to the monks of St Mary's Abbey in Dublin, from which we get Abbey Street and St Mary's Abbey in Dublin. But they were granted those lands, and they occupied an enormous area that went as far as Bullock Harbour near Dalkey, where they built, for example, Bullock Harbour. And to imagine how different that landscape would have been at the time that this proclamation was made in 1836 compared to what we know today in the suburban area that is Monkstown. But many of the buildings that were there still remain, and slightly later was the Church of Ireland Church, which was built at the junction in the centre of Monkstown village. It's a building that many people will know. It's a particularly beautiful building, and it's one that you can visit as well. But I also think it's worth mentioning that the schoolhouse that was attached to it was recently lovingly and extensively refurbished by the parish there, and Rector Roy Byrne deserves enormous credit for the work that was done there, restoring it to what it had been, and it was opened recently. And as I say, it deserves a note that, again, that landscape has changed so significantly. But I think what is perhaps more telling from this bill is, as I say, this is an enormous body of work that had to be done, and in 100 years' time, a similar bill may have to be brought before these houses to carry out a similar cleaning exercise of past and obsolete legislation. And that may be necessary, I don't know. But one of the points that I repeatedly make in these houses when we have legislation going through, particularly amending legislation, is twofold. Firstly, it's largely illegible for anybody who doesn't have the corpus of legislation that preceded it. So if you have a bill that amends 3 or 4 other pieces of legislation, and the section will be amendment to section 9 of the Principal Act, and then you're told the Principal Act in subsection 2 is amended in paragraph A by replacing and with or, nobody knows what that means without also getting the Principal Act that's being amended, and that Act itself may also have been amended elsewhere. And the point that I make in that regard is that we should actually be, this is a project that requires an awful lot of man hours, and reference has been made to those working on this project both within the Office of the Attorney General, but particularly the Law Reform Commission, which does fantastic work. And I think, again, credit is due to the Law Reform Commission, because as a state agency, they are one of the agencies that delivers time and time again on what they say they will do. They deliver reports that bring common sense solutions to these houses and are all too often ignored. But they have to do that work because it hasn't been done on an ongoing basis. And the point that I make in relation to those amending pieces of legislation is it would make much more sense to take the Principal Act that is being amended, repeal it, and restate it in the amending Act, so that it is restated with all of the changes that are being made. And it may be an awkward job on an ongoing basis, for those who are writing the legislation. But what it would do is it would negate the necessity for projects like this in 50, 100 or whatever number of years' time from now to be done, if on an ongoing basis we were creating consolidated legislation essentially when we sought to amend an older piece of legislation. And sometimes the legislation isn't that old, and you could pick particular subjects like road traffic legislation, for example. The laws in relation to road traffic have been amended dozens of times, literally. So if you pick up the Road Traffic Amendment Act 2010, it is very difficult to read without, again, putting together a series of other acts that were passed over the preceding 40 years, primarily since the Principal Act in 1961. But there are any number of examples of that. Taxes consolidation was done in the 90s and served us very well at that stage. But again, that was an enormous project to consolidate all the taxation legislation into one bill in Act in 1997. That has since been amended time and time again. And so when we come to the budget, for example, later this year, and we're passing the Finance Act and the Appropriations Act and the Social Welfare Act and all those other pieces of legislation, my suggestion is that it would be much more sensible to take the act that is being amended, or even the acts that are being amended, and instead of leaving them there and changing them and having a later document that amends them, bring them all together, repeal the old ones, and pass a new piece of legislation which clearly states what it actually intends to do. And not only would that save perhaps future generations from sitting down for many, many hours and going through thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of documents and seeing whether they're obsolete or not, but it would also make that legislation much more legible to ordinary citizens. So if you wanted to know what the law actually said, you could take down the Act and it would be very clear from reading it, insofar as any Act is clear, but it would be easy to read that Act to see what it actually says. We don't do that, and I've never really been given a convincing reason as to why we don't do it, because it would be in service of the populace of Ireland if we did do it, that we would make those laws more accessible to them and more easily read. But as I say, we could spend all day picking out interesting and individual items that are being expunged through this legislation, but I think great credit is due to those who have done this work, who have spent the time, not just identifying items that should be undone or repealed, but also checking that there isn't a consequence from them further down the line, that there isn't subsequent legislation that relies on them, or whatever the case may be. And it gives an enormous advantage to us as lawmakers, but also to those working with laws, whether they're in the courts or in other areas of the law, to have a situation where they can say with some certainty whether an instrument has been repealed or not. And as I say, it is the legacy of the statute law revision group that we will have that, and this bill is just the latest iteration of that. So congratulations to them, thank them for their work, and I look forward to the passage of the legislation into law.
Thank you, Deputy Warden.